All right, let's kick off. Well, it is Careers in Finance brought to you by Valuation Masterclass Bootcamp. If you're watching this, you can get 100% off the bootcamp using the coupon codes live, or if you're a student live. Of course, if you're a student, we'll ask for proof of enrollment. That's valuationmasterclass.com/bootcamp, or scan the QR code. So today, I'm excited to bring on one of our guests, and I think we're going to have a fun and interesting conversation. So let me bring you on right here. Sam Gibb. Sam, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what it is that you're doing right now?
Hey, Andrew. Thanks for having me on today. Yeah, so right now I'm running a seed stage fintech fund that's focused on Southeast Asia. So in the VC space, it's a bit different from some of the other things that I've been doing throughout my career, and we can kind of touch on that in a bit. Yeah, really focused on helping early stage entrepreneurs to go through the seed A to the next level.
And why are you interested in seed stage? I mean, when I look at that, sometimes I think, it's so hard, at that stage. It's exciting, but it's hard.
Yeah, so the reason I got into it and like looking at the seed stage is because at one of my previous roles, I was constrained from investing in public equities. So then instead of being frustrated by that, I started to look around and look at where the opportunities were. At the time, so this is almost 10 years ago now, actually about 10 years, maybe slightly more. I could see that the Singapore government was putting a lot of incentives into the ecosystem to try to build it up. And I figured that Singapore could become the Silicon Valley of Southeast Asia in a couple of years, and I wanted to be involved with that. Although this was a headline that TechCrunch ran last year, and it has taken a lot longer than I would have thought to actually build up that ecosystem, and I could touch on the reasons why I think that is too. But started to get involved more with the angel investing side of things. Then when I left that role, I started to formalize what I was doing, creating a small fund, and then subsequently Resolution Ventures, which is what I'm working on now after building a bit of a track record there.
So tell us about Resolution Ventures and, what's the stuff that you guys are doing. Before you do that, let's just welcome some of the people to the show. Tirada, welcome to the show. And also Patipat, also welcome. And Supanat, and of course Alex, who you just met. He's listening in. He's always listening in. We have Sujimoto Shinja. Good to see you, Shinja. And all right. So tell us about Resolution Ventures and kind of like the stuff that you guys are doing, what you're into, and what the future looks like.
So the ideal company that we're generally looking for is they're going to have a couple $100,000 in revenue, maybe $500,000 to $1.5 million in the 12 months that we're investing in the business. Really ideally here, we're looking for a company that's solving a Southeast Asia first problem. So it's something that's very specific to the region, but could then be exported to the rest of the world. An example of that might be, so one of the portfolio companies, IPID, they do pay now. So I think there's an equivalent in Thailand as well. Generally, the pre-transaction validation, which this is done domestically. Mm-hmm. There are some interlinkages within Southeast Asia that are being built up now as a result of the work from the regulators. But being able to do that internationally is quite a big deal. And this is something that is going to be very specific to Southeast Asia first, because you're dealing with a lot of cross-border transfers. If we were talking about the US or Europe, most of the transfers are going to be done in US dollars or in euros. They're not going to deal with the same kind of cross-border issues that we're going to deal with here. So it's a very specific problem to this part of the world, but can also be exported and used in other parts of the world too, because the cost of a failed payment could be 30 to 50 US dollars. So there's a real cost to businesses if they get it wrong. If they can see, yes, this money is going to the right beneficiary before they hit go, it's a massive plus. So we're trying to do that, trying to invest in those kind of companies, and then also actually make a material difference to the entrepreneurs that we work with as well. There's some stories, some I can't touch on here, but there's been some times when we've really rolled up our sleeves and got involved with the entrepreneurs that we're working with.
And let's just talk briefly about your career, because we want to think about careers in finance. I love to tell people that, I've had a great 3 decades in finance that I've enjoyed, all the way. I mean, yeah, of course, I had some bad bosses along the way, and I had some kind of shitty situations. It happens, but overall, I had a pretty great career, and part of what I want to do is help people see different paths that suit them, because I think ultimately that's really what it comes down to, is finding the things that suit you. So maybe you can talk a little bit about first, like VC, what type of person would want to work in VC, for a young person, and then maybe a little bit of your history.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this question up, because I do want to double back and touch on some things I missed before. One of the main reasons I wanted to get involved with VC was because I realized I'm relatively good at talking to people and dealing with the interpersonal elements. Because there's some people in finance that isn't the case. They'd rather work with the numbers, and that's fine. Like, there's definitely a place for that. But also, I was of the opinion, so having done the CFA and gone through all the quantitative aspects of it, that if I really wanted to do well on the public market side, I would either have to have deeper pockets than most of the other investors that I was competing against, because at the time, so this is over the last kind of 5 to 10 years, with quantitative easing, it was all up and to the right. So it was very hard to be able to stand out as a stock picker and show you had any talent skill there. And so you either have to have deeper pockets, or you had to put a quantitative overlay on what you're doing. So something more like what I'm guessing Bridgewater's doing there too. I didn't feel like I had the temperament to go down that path. So then I was looking at, okay, well, with the skill set that I've got, being able to understand a business relatively quickly, and being able to talk to and work with other people, how could I best leverage that? And feel that is in the VC space, because especially at the early stage, you don't have access to as much information. So while it's not like I'm shooting in the dark here and just taking a heap of punts, and there are funds that do that, and there's a place for that, right? Just being able to get a reasonable amount of diversification, and there's math that you can put around this too. It says if you've got at least 20 in portfolio investments, got a 95% chance of being able to return the fund, right? So if you're getting more diversification, yeah, you can still do relatively well. But for myself, I'd rather have more specific investments in a tighter knit portfolio where we can actually make a difference to the founders that we're investing in. Because when I started the first fund, and when I first got into this, I had 3 things that I wanted to prove. So one, that I could actually generate a return for the investors. Secondly, that I could actually help the entrepreneur. More importantly, actually, that I could actually help the entrepreneurs that I'm working with. And thirdly, that I could actually get into competitive rounds. And over a 12-month period, effectively ticked off those goals, which gave me the confidence to go and move on to a second fund. Do you want me to kind of dial it back and go a bit before that too? Because I mean, obviously I'm not from Southeast Asia.
Yep.
So, I mean, starting off, this is going to be the more interesting aspect for some of the listeners here. So starting off, I actually wanted to be a lawyer, and this will predate most of the people listening in, watching Boston Legal, and I thought it was pretty interesting doing that kind of legal analysis, and you'd also be working with a lot of people. I did an internship at a law firm, and it was pretty far from that. But I did do a stint in the tax team, and I found that pretty interesting because you're dealing with the numbers plus the legal aspects. It was a very broad field and generally pretty complex. So there's a lot of stuff that you can learn there. Because learning is what drew me to it. I'd say anyone who wants to have a career in finance, it's the key is learning, right? Like if you like learning and you're a self-driven learner, then it's great because there's always more that you can learn. So then I had a look around and I was like, well, if you want to learn and be one of the best tax attorneys you can be, how would you go and do that? I felt that the best way to do that would be to go and actually work within an accounting firm, because accounting firms will have tax teams of 100 to 400 people, whereas the legal teams might have 3 or 4 people in their tax teams. So ended up actually starting off my career at PwC. And I thought you could be a cool accountant and you could be a bit different as an accountant, but then I was pretty quickly proven wrong. It was one of the first days, like the first kind of orientation week. I remember walking out of there with my girlfriend at the time, is now my wife, and I turned around to her and I was like, I'm not going to last long here. This is not for me. And it took about 9 months until I actually transitioned. And I was very lucky. I'll say very, very lucky at the time. So in New Zealand at the time, there was a KiwiSaver coming up, a superannuation scheme. So the mutual fund industry really started to blossom there. And I got a relatively early role at a boutique fund manager, who's now the largest boutique fund manager in New Zealand. And the principals there were very passionate about developing young analysts and also giving you a chance. So pretty quickly, I was running my own P&L and very involved in making the investment decisions, going out there, talking to companies. And I really enjoyed that because you're always picking up on the little bits of the scuttlebutt. You go out to an office, you'd have a walk around with the CEO. And I remember the key partner who's since passed, but then after the meeting, as we were driving back, he was like, "You see that?" And I was like, "I thought it was kind of reasonable." He's like, "Nah, he never talked to any of the staff when we went through the tour." And I was like, "Yeah, he's right." But it's like, it was such a little thing, but he was like, "Yeah, he's probably not in the business that often. Like he's not going to be a good manager." It's just like a very little thing, but he had the experience to understand that that's probably going to make a material difference to the company. And so like knowing those things and understanding that, and going back to the VC aspect, that's quite clear and it's easy to understand when you've talked to a number of entrepreneurs, and it's not necessarily going to be reflected in the price because you don't have a publicly traded price that you're transacting on for the private companies here. Whereas in public markets, if you're able to pick up that scuttlebutt, get that information, it does take quite a while for that to be reflected through into the price. So there's definitely a lot of opportunities in public markets still, but you really got to do the work. So
yeah, it reminded me of every time I go, when I was young, I worked at a factory for Pepsi, and I used to put up charts and graphs on the wall to work with the team. And, I always updated them every day. And then whenever I go to a factory, the first thing I ever looked at as an analyst was always, let's look at their charts and graphs. But what they didn't realize I'm looking at is I'm just looking at the date of the latest data point on the graph. And most of the times you find out that it's 5 weeks old.
Yeah.
And meaning that graph is useless and it's meaningless and they're not using it. So it's those little things that you see as you go around, like whether that person giving you a tour picked something up off the floor or whether they just walk past it, the relationships they have with the, staff. I mean, all of those things you observe. As an analyst, I went out to many different, places, but in your case, it's really trying to make an assessment in the VC space is so much harder because, man, they're just putting on such a great face, it seems like. But how would you compare what you saw in your early days and assessing that compared to how you look at VCs?
So it's very easy to put on a strong face initially, but the way that I've started to invest, the style that I developed was actually working with entrepreneurs over a 3 to 6 month period before actually making an investment, as opposed to having there's still a rigorous process around it when we actually start to do the work moving towards an investment. But there's a lot of informal work that goes on at the start to work out if there's actually a match. Is there a mutual level of respect there? And sometimes I think in the region, especially, most of the VCs actually get it wrong, whereas they kind of try to position themselves above the entrepreneurs to say that I'm the gatekeeper of capital and you should do whatever I say. Whereas I'd rather look at the relationship as more as peers, or even put them above me, because a lot of the time they've done more than I've done. So I've got to be respectful of that, right? So if you spend enough time with the entrepreneurs, you can work out how they look at problems, how they solve things, and you look through most of the facade that's there. And it's not, it's something that is definitely workable over time. But at face value, this stuff's really hard. Yeah.
Yep. We got a question here. Hold on, let's bring it up. This is Felix Tan, and he is in Singapore. He was actually one of my students in the valuation masterclass. He said, what are some tips to find a company that really supports employee development super well? of course, we're talking about he's early in his career trying to find a place. But from your experience over the years, what are some things that you have observed that this is a good place for me, or this is not a good place for me, as you mentioned, in your first day, in your story that you told earlier?
Oh, I'm probably not a great person to answer this actually, because going back to what I was saying earlier, you really have to be self-driven and interested in learning and developing yourself if you want to be an analyst. So I can also talk about like the transition coming from New Zealand and then coming over here, but we'll touch on that in a bit. But specifically for this question, like in all of the roles that I've actually had, I was given a limited amount of mentorship. And if I think about it in how to describe it in teaching terms, there's very rarely actually a roadmap given. And I tried to explain this to another analyst. I was like, look, I can give you the start point and some of the information that we have now, and I can give you the end point and what I think that looks like right now. I don't know what the process is going to look like to get to that end point. I have a gut feel as to what it's all going to look like, but what the start and end looks like. I don't know what the rest looks like. Maybe it's something that's really fast and really easy for you to do. Maybe you uncover something and that leads you down a different pathway. You do some analysis and you're like, oh no, like this whole sector is actually just going to go bust. You can't tell until you actually start to do the work. And I guess some of the better mentors are going to help give you relatively broad guidelines that you can follow and pull you back when you're going off track. But I haven't really had an environment where the principals and partners have been actively engaged in my development. It's something that I've always had to drive myself.
I mean, I think that's a good point right there, is that as a young person, you may be looking for guidance in a company and you just may not find it. It's nice to think that, there's great bosses and great companies that are doing training. But in the end, if I think about the people and the companies that I work for, it was like, get on board and start contributing. We'll show you what we can. But I'm super, my boss was super busy. Everybody's super busy.
It's small teams and it's eat what you kill, right? It's like, yeah, go and do it. If you've got specific questions, yeah, I can help you. But if you want me to give you a whole framework, I mean, by the time I've set up the framework, I've done the work. This is hard.
It's a good point. I mean, the only other way is if you say, okay, I'm going to go work for a good analyst and I'm going to be a supporter for that analyst. I'm going to be an assistant analyst to them. Then you're going to have one-on-one time, all the time. And he's going to say, okay, do this, do that. Okay, that doesn't make sense. But if you just go straight into being an analyst, which I did, and I think a lot of people go into maybe covering small companies or something like that, it's like every man for himself, go do it. And that's why self-learning is so critical in that space.
Yeah. And so doubling back to one of the questions that you'd asked before too, about analysts in the VC space. And honestly, it's probably not something that I would actively recommend for someone who's more interested in finance to move down the VC path, just because it's very hard to build rapport with an entrepreneur to start with. And it's also very hard to be able to add value to their businesses. And this isn't actually a fair comment too, because in some analysts and people who are drawn to finance do have more of an entrepreneurial bent, right? And so if you've got more of an entrepreneurial bent and you're looking at this to think about, okay, so I want to understand businesses and I also want to know how to be able to build a business. Okay, yeah, then that's something that might be reasonable. I think it's really challenging. I think going down a more formal path where you're working at a fund that's looking at publicly traded equities or either buy side, sell side is going to be better. If you actually wanted to have development, I'd say you've really got to go sell side, right? So sell side have development programs. There's a massive amount of analysts in your cohort that you could talk to. You're all going to be going through the same stuff at the same time. So if you can get into something like that, that's going to be useful.
Yeah. Before we go, we've got some other questions, but before we get to those questions, just to remind everybody that the Careers in Finance is brought to you by Valuation Masterclass Bootcamp. And the next bootcamp starts on September 4th. So if you're interested, just learn more at valuationmasterclass.com/bootcamp, or scan that QR code, and we'll see you there. Can't wait to launch the next boot camp. We've got about 24 people signed up from about 7 different countries right now, so that's pretty exciting. We got another question here. Supernut says, what topic have you been particularly interested in lately? Maybe from an investment perspective or any other perspective that comes up to you.
I don't know if there's been any topic that I've been particularly interested in lately. It's been a really difficult time in the market. So from a VC perspective, over the last couple of years, what we saw is valuations really crept up in 21, 22. We saw them starting to come off around this time last year, but there's still a lot of normalization that's going on in the market. One of the problems that I'm really dealing with is that there are a lot of smaller funds that shot up over the last couple of years that didn't have a lot of discipline. And so that's meant that the valuations were set a lot higher than is currently justifiable after a year, 2 years of traction, 2 years of deploying that capital and trying to build a business. So we're kind of constrained being a seed stage fund because even if we really believe in a business and believe that can go somewhere, there also needs to be either a road to profitability really early on or sufficient investment interest to be able to take it to the next round. And the gap between seed and A in Southeast Asia, I think, is relatively large because when you're talking about Series A, Series B, there is more of a private equity bent when people are looking at the businesses.
Right. I see Hillary's here. Hillary, welcome. Make sure you ask questions. All right. For anybody that wants to ask, just type in your questions. Here we say, I'm trying to explore which area in finance to pursue. So I'd like to know what aspects of your career do you find most appealing and what key factors influence your decision to pursue this path? You know, one of the interesting things that I always say is like every job is the same because we all have similar tasks. You know, sometimes we got to call, sometimes we got to write, sometimes we got to do face-to-face meetings, sometimes we got to do spreadsheets. And I always tell people to focus on the area that you like the most, that you do the most. So I wonder in the VC space, like what is your time occupied with?
A lot of meetings, a lot of research, there's a lot of networking. There's there's a networking aspect to this as well, right? Like,
yep.
It's not just being able to talk to the entrepreneurs and find the right opportunities, but then it's also being able to find the right business partners to be able to open the doors to them. There's a lot of times when something's going wrong in a portfolio company, and so you're going to have to jump on the phone. Maybe you're talking to suppliers, maybe you're talking to all of the investors to try to resolve a particular issue there, and you need to get buy-in. There've been times with one portfolio company where I kind of signed wired, and then they pinged me a week later and said, "Hey, can we catch it for a beer? We've got an exit offer on the table." Okay, like it's quick, but it's probably not going to be the ideal, but we'll see what happens here. And I mean, this was towards the end of the year, so kind of November, and I figured, it should be tidied up January, February next year. It should have been pretty simple, but mind you, this was 2019, and it was in the tourism hospitality space. So I got a call in May, and the lead investors had a blow up with the founders, and the deal was looking like it was going to fall apart. But the acquirer actually represented about 50% of the total addressable market for the company too. So if this didn't happen, plus at the time, and it doesn't seem like a lot in hindsight, but there were 20 to 30,000 new COVID cases a day in the US, and the acquirer was in a build or buy mindset. So if they realized that tourism was going to be shut down for 2 years, of course, they would have just built it themselves. They didn't know that. So I had to kind of dive in there. And I remember this time pretty well because our helper had gone back to the Philippines at the time. So it was my wife, and we had a newborn, us and another kid too. So we were stuck in the house, and I was working from 6 till midday, doing most of my calls in the morning, and then some work to midday, take care of the kids in the afternoon, have dinner, put the kids down, tidy the house, and then I'd jump on calls till 11 o'clock at night for best part of a month and a half to be able to get that over the line. But so a lot of time spent talking to people. But also going back to the question here about what aspects do you find most appealing? And I've kind of talked about growth mindset and trying to find what I've tried to do is I've tried to find what I'm naturally good at. Also, my background, my education is in law. So I got an undergraduate degree in law and management with majors in accounting and finance. So can deal with the accounting aspects of it, can deal with the legal aspects, and can deal with the EQ aspects of dealing with issues in a business. Being able to mold all those things together is actually relatively difficult. If you're going to talk to a lawyer, a lot of the time they're going to say, well, this is what we should do. But is this actually commercially viable or commercially reasonable? A lot of the time the answer is no. Like we don't need to deal with this. It's not that big of a deal. We can move on. We can move beyond this. So knowing when to do those things is important, but also, so tracing my career now. So start off in kind of hedge funds. When we came over to Singapore, so I wanted to have an opportunity to be in a deep capital market than New Zealand, Australia. At the time, there was like 200 companies listed in New Zealand, 2,000 in Australia. Kind of understand the market relatively quickly. Plus, there was a ESOP scheme. So investing over 3 years, I felt like, well, the golden handcuffs are going to get pretty heavy relatively quickly. So if I don't fly the coop now, I'm going to be here for good. And after my wife and I had this conversation, then an opportunity came up in Singapore. So we came up. We'd never been here before. We came up here, and took a while actually. It took me a long time to get the gig, and I can actually talk about how I got the role. Actually, got a couple of roles. I'll double back to this. So remind me if I don't. But I ended up working in a private equity firm. So effectively heading up the valuation team in a private equity firm based in Indonesia. That was eye-opening. So obviously there's certain things that you have to deal with being in Indonesia, but at the same time, I realized that I wasn't really one for private equity. I like to have a bit more stuff going on, and private equity is pretty slow. Like it's very slow. Actually, at the time, I took up ultra running. I started running ultra marathons because I had free time. So I was like, okay, I'll go and run a half marathon in the morning, then go into the office kind of thing. Definitely didn't feel like I was optimally using my cognitive capacity. And then from there, transitioned to a hedge fund, kind of doing long, short, Asian equities. But the premise of the fund, they were more focused on, also the main fund at the shop was small cap, deep value, activist Japanese equities, which is actually a pretty cool strategy because it's very difficult to take that activist bet in Japan. And then from there, I kind of spun out and started doing my own thing. So I've seen the spectrum, and I've done the public market side of things, done the private market side of things, and the mature private market side of things as well. So I can kind of see what's there, the career paths, what's required, and also what the competitive landscape looks like. Because if you're dealing in public equities, incredibly competitive, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you've done this. It's you have to be a lot smarter than the next guy they're all very smart.
Yeah.
I'm kind of lazy. So I was trying to look for my edge and what suited my temperament. So I think when you're thinking about roles in finance and what suits you, you have to think about what your temperament is.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the sell side where I was all my career, it's kind of front line every day, you know, it's like, it's intense.
It's hard. I think it's great. I think it's definitely a great place to start your career on the sell side. You learn so much, and it is intense. And so you're just going through things so quickly. And so I could write also, I feel like it was a bit more of an old school situation when I was coming up, because if you miss some things in your note, you're yelled at. Like you were made to feel like an absolute idiot in the investment meeting, right? And you don't make that mistake again. But on the sell side, you're getting that multiple times a day from multiple different clients, right? So yeah, it's good, but also the energy and the time to do that is massive.
Yeah. Yeah. I enjoyed it. I mean, I enjoyed it for 20 years to be head of research and an analyst. And it was, you know, it was fun, but you know, eventually you just get tired of it. It's really is on the front lines. Yep. So Toluwase, good to see you. Good morning. Make sure for everybody that if you have any questions, make sure to ask. One of the you said you were going to go back and talk about how you got the job. I think for a lot of young people that would be a really good one.
Yeah, so for actually both of the roles that I'd got here in Singapore, both the times I just went out and hustled. I wrote up a case on a stock and basically pitched my idea. And so the thing that I went in with is I was like, look, give me half an hour of your time. I'll pitch you an idea. Best case scenario, you get a good idea and you essentially get an analyst out of it. Worst case scenario, you've had a pitch for free.
Yeah, and a cup of coffee.
And I don't think there's many people that actually do this.
It's a great idea. No, I think you're right. Not many people do that. So I think that is, a great idea. In fact, I want to tell a story related to this, and that is, I had a guy when I worked at a particular broker. My boss was really tough, and he was good. He was really smart, and he was very careful in hiring analysts. Many meetings and all that. And basically, I asked him, "What are you doing today?" And he goes, "Oh, I got some guy coming in to interview and to be an analyst." And I said, "Oh, interesting." So that guy walked in. He went into the conference room. Then my boss went in, sat down. An hour later, they finished. They left. And the guy left, and I asked my boss, I went to his office, I said, how'd it go? He said, I hired him. I was like, what? And he said, that guy came in and he pitched. He talked about his personal portfolio. He's got 10 stocks in it. He explained why each one of those stocks is in the portfolio. And he convinced me that that is exactly what I need my analyst to be doing to the client. And he was, and so he was hired. So this is a great idea, and I think it's a hack. Have a story to tell.
You don't even have to be investing the money too. I mean, it can be a paper portfolio.
Correct.
I think about it on the engineer side, because dealing with tech people all the time, and a lot of the time they're like, oh, how do you become a full stack engineer? How do you get the experience? It's like a lot of the time people aren't going to give you the opportunity. You've got to make the opportunity for yourself. So if you're hacking away in your free time and developing your own portfolio, so on more the engineering side, but then on the finance side, yeah, you can look at some publicly traded equities and say this is what I'd invest in and why. Or like when I was looking at hiring an analyst, the question I asked is, okay, name 3 companies that we should look at and potentially invest in. And it weeds through the people pretty quickly, because first of all, it has to be seed stage, and say 70-80% of people put Grab. And I was like, if Grab's, I wouldn't even classify it as fintech, and it's way beyond where we could potentially touch it. But people hadn't even put the thought into, okay, so what's reasonable, what's in the industry, what kinds of things could they potentially look at? So yeah, massive amount of value to be added, just spending the time doing that.
That's a huge tip. I want to wrap up by asking you to think for a moment, and I'm gonna go to the audience for just a second with a final word from our sponsor. And while I do that, maybe you can think about kind of what is your advice from your life, from your experience. What is your advice for a young person who wants to build a career in finance? It can be what lessons you've learned, maybe the steps that they should take. Think about that for a moment, and let me just do a final message from our sponsor. 1 second. So remember that the Careers in Finance is brought to you by Valuation Masterclass Bootcamp, and you can get $100 extra off with these coupon codes. That's live and student live. And you can do that at valuationmasterclass.com/bootcamp or scan the QR code. Okay, now you've had some time to think about it. What would be some of your advice?
I'm just going to echo what I've said before too, and it's just have a growth mindset and keep trying to learn. If you're naturally inquisitive and you want to learn a lot, I think you'll do relatively well in finance. It might take a while to be able to find the right role that matches your temperament, but if you have that mindset, then you're probably going to do relatively well. It's most people either aren't hungry enough or hard enough to be able to deal with some of the setbacks that you're going to face along the way. So just
Get
have a level
tough,
of
be
resilience
hungry,
and start
growth
learning.
mindset. Those
Yeah.
are all great pieces of advice. I mean,
Like, sorry to interrupt, but then when I was, sorry, the other thing that I want to say is when I'm looking back at my career and the things that I did, there's no time that I think I wasted. There's times where I think I was in a frustrating position and maybe the role didn't match my skill set, but I never wasted the time. I always did the work. I always learned more.
Yeah, that's great. Great point. Never waste time, even if you're in a difficult situation, a challenging situation, a situation you may know I'm not going to be here forever. Don't miss that time, whether it's, improving yourself with your work, whether that's studying for your CFA or whatever else you're studying for. Take advantage of that time. Well, Sam, I want to thank you for, taking the time here to discuss about your career in finance and what you're doing right now. And it's interesting to get to know you and what you're doing from my perspective too. I just love the conversation. So I just want to thank you for coming on. And you and I will talk for a couple minutes as soon as we finish.
Thanks very much for having me too.
Yeah, it's been great. So I want to thank everybody who's come on to listen in and to hear what we're doing. And we're talking about careers in finance. And remember, the Careers in Finance is sponsored by Valuation Masterclass Bootcamp, where you can learn all about valuation and all about building your career in finance. Of course, valuation is a major part of finance, and so building a skill there is critical. I want to thank everybody for attending again, and I hope to see you all on the next Careers in Finance.